Helen Sewell was born the oldest of three sisters in 1896 in Mare Island, California, where her father was a US Navy commander. But tragedy struck the family when her mother died in 1901 at the age of only 33, when Helen was just 5 years old. Soon after, the girls moved with their father to the Pacific island of Guam, when he was appointed governor. But only 2 years later, her father also died prematurely at the age of 53, and the orphaned sisters returned to the USA to live in Brooklyn with an aunt and uncle. When Helen was still only 12 years old, she became the youngest person to attend the Pratt Institute. And in addition to more formal study in her later teens, she also spent some time being taught by the Cubist sculptor and painter Alexander Archipenko. I could find no information regarding when she actually began her career, but it is recorded that Sewell's earliest illustrations were for greetings cards. And although I've been unable to date these nostalgic, sentimental Christmas scenes, they may be examples from that period. Her first book commission was The Cruise of the Little Dipper and Other Fairy Tales, written by Suzanne Langer, which was published in 1923. For this book she created a collection of charming stylized line drawings which were printed quite small, in a deep desaturated pink on pale sepia paper stock, giving them a visual appeal which served to accentuate the woodland fairy tale nature of the stories. But following this there was an inexplicable hiatus of 5 years until 1928, when Menagerie, a collection of poems for children by Mary Britton Miller, was published. As the title suggests, most of the poems, although certainly not all, were animal-themed, and Sewell created a diverse range of images which, although they resembled woodcut illustrations, were actually created with brush, pen and ink. And as with the earlier Little Dipper book, they made for an entertaining collection of graphically solid folk art-influenced monochromes. A year later she also illustrated the book Mr. Hermit Crab, written by the 14-year-old British author Mimpsy Rees. This was another monochrome publication, but on this occasion the illustrations were of a considerably lighter touch than either of her previous commissions, and featured the conspicuous and tightly controlled use of stippling to create tonal effects and solidity of the visual elements. And additionally she created this full-colour frontispiece. In 1930 she published ABC for Every Day, a delightful Art Deco-styled alphabet book which made creative use of limited flat colours applied at printing. But unfortunately I could only track down a couple of tantalising examples. Sewell also had her own ambitions as a writer, and in 1931 she published A Head for Happy, the tale of a search to find a suitable head for a life-size puppet made by a young girl. This was not so much an illustrated novel, but more an early example of what we now refer to as a picture book. The text was little more than captions, and it was the images which more eloquently told the story. And the absurdity of her own minimal written narrative was ably enhanced by the drawings she produced. A year later she illustrated The Little House in the Big Woods, written by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This was the first in a long-running series of books about the lives of a pioneer family in rural America, which became immensely popular in the USA. And it featured another frontispiece showcasing her highly atmospheric use of colour. It was also in 1932 that she illustrated The Dream Keeper, a collection of poems aimed at black children and teenagers, written by Langston Hughes, another book for which there is sadly precious little evidence to show. 1933 saw the publication of another of her own stories, Blue Barns, with a collection of intentionally naively executed monochromes. These images constituted a stylistic departure from her other work to date, as they were created using what appears to be graphite or some other textural medium. By this point she had become very prolific, and 2 more books were published in that same year. Where is Adelaide was a children's novel by Eliza Orne White, which played to Sewell's manifest strengths in the charming nostalgic evocation of days gone by. Laura Ingalls Wilder's Farmer Boy also contained similarly styled monochromes, and the added bonus of an accomplished full-colour frontispiece, Even more remarkably, in 1934, no less than 4 books were published featuring her illustrations. A first Bible by Jean West Maury contained stipple monochromes depicting elongated stylized figures from key moments from the Old and New Testaments. Away Goes Sally was a considerably more light-hearted publication written by Elizabeth Coatsworth, with yet more nostalgic folksy monochromes produced to illuminate this tale of a young girl in 18th century America. It was also in 1934 that colour first played a more significant role in some of Sewell's books. Blue Bonnets for Lucinda by Francis Clark Sayers featured ink and graphite drawings with limited but agreeable flat spot colours added selectively, with considerable appeal to the supported and textured monochromes. The only examples I could find to show for her charming deco-style visualisation of Cinderella in the same year were the cover and this selection of page illustrations, which due to their poor resolution wouldn't stand presentation any bigger. This remarkable run of creative productivity continued into 1935 with yet another quartet of illustrated books. Anne Francis by Eliza Orne White contained a series of light-hearted and lightly rendered drawings from Sewell, and 1935 was also the year of publication of arguably Laura Ingalls Wilder's most popular in her series, The Little House on the Prairie. Peter and Gretchen of Old Nuremberg by Viola M. Jones was a particularly attractive book, with many images created by Sewell using her formally and fairly minimally hatched line style, with the addition of flat pastel colours applied selectively to each of the illustrations. In quite a few of the images, the line work which had been created as black was frequently printed in one of the colours from the palette, and this device succeeded in producing a credible optical illusion of greater than usual depth. A Round of Carols by T. Tertius Noble was the last of 1935, for which Sewell returned to her more textural application of tonal effects. The actual illustrations were all printed in monochrome, but there was the addition of a single colour overlay to produce an oval vignetted shape. In the years that followed, there were another 3 in the Little House series by Laura Ingalls Wilder, for which she was now being assisted by her contemporary Mildred Boyle. But as they were pretty much identical to the earlier books, I'm moving swiftly along to show others, such as 10 Saints by Eleanor Farjon, which was published in 1936. Despite the application of uncommonly bright flat colours, these images still evoke medieval woodcut styling, and I have no proof of it, but I suspect they were directly reimagined from medieval originals. In 1937, Sewell illustrated 2 collections for children by Winnie the Pooh author A. Milne, both of which were rendered in full colour. The Magic Hill and The Princess and the Apple Tree featured particularly enchanting illustrations, which combined washes of watercolour enhanced with some form of crayon or coloured pencil and graphite. All the illustrations she produced for this pair of books were uniformly possessed of considerable sentimental appeal in their evocation of childhood, and although idealised, they remained generally free of overt fantasy and focused instead on the small pleasures of daily life from the child's perspective. 1938's illustrated edition of Emily Bronte's Jane Eyre was an entirely unexpected but creatively successful venture into more adult, and in this case far from upbeat material. The images she produced were printed in a deep blue, which reflected the morose and occasionally disturbing nature of the story. And Sewell demonstrated with apparent ease that despite her formality of composition and stylised approach to figure work, she could nevertheless credibly evoke the more complex emotions involved in such reading material for adults. And on the back of this success in 1940, she was commissioned by the Limited Editions Club to illustrate Jane Austen's enduringly popular novel Pride and Prejudice. And although Austen's narratives were considerably lighter in tone than Bronte's, Sewell rose to the challenge once more with a collection of witty narrative monochromes printed in sepia on a dark cream paper stock. I don't know whether to be surprised or not, but it's recorded that she very rarely used actual models to inform her work, and generally relied on her imagination, even in more plausibly representational images such as these. In 1942, Sewell illustrated a book of myths taken from Thomas Bulfinch's Age of Fable, originally written in 1800. Alongside some very precise line-only drawings, she also created a collection of tonal and considerably more solid images with a blue colour overlay. All were possessed of considerable neoclassical appeal filtered through an Art Deco lens. And even if they were lacking in any real emotional dimension, they nevertheless made for a compelling series of aesthetically considered images. In 1942, The Blue-Eyed Lady by Ferenc Molnar was published, and for this commission Sewell returned to the use of full colour. Her graceful line work formed the basis of the images, but they also had tonal pastel colours added selectively to what were essentially a series of character studies. And 2 years later, in 1944, she used this technique again for Boat Children of Canton by Marion B. Ward, but with a more demonstrative presence and greater intensity in the application of colour. This was another prolific year for her, which also saw the publication of Christmas Magic by James S. Tippett, for which she worked again in her by now expected combination of line wash and grainy shading to produce a collection of amusing and particularly decorative images guaranteed to entertain the young reader. The same was true of The Big Green Umbrella, another book written by her frequent and by now long-term collaborator Elizabeth Coatsworth, which again demonstrated the creative symbiosis of their association. In 1946, Sewell returned to religious themes with Once There Was a Little Boy by Dorothy Cunhart. And once more her images for this book were created with a blend of intensely textured shading combined with overlaid washes of generally subdued colour. But the same year's The Brave Bantam by Louise Seaman featured a collection of pen and ink drawings so gestural I wouldn't have believed they were by Sewell if it wasn't for her credit in the book. This appears to have been the only time she used this technique, and why she stepped outside her more expected formal approach and why she never returned to it are both mysteries for which I can provide no meaningful answer. In 1947, Sewell ventured again into what was for her previously unexplored territory, with Three Tall Tales, a picture book collaboration with a writer known only as Ileska. These deliberately improbable stories were illustrated using a limited colour palette, and alongside full-page scenes there were images presented in sequential groups, giving the book a particularly comic strip appeal. And as with the scribbled Brave Bantam, this was a departure which was never to be repeated. At this point it seems Sewell slowed down considerably, and it wasn't until 1951 that Secrets and Surprises, written by Ermengarde Ebel, was published. And despite the title, this was a book which depicted everyday contemporary life in the USA. But there was another pause of 3 years before she appeared again in 1954 with colour illustrations for The Thanksgiving Story by Alice Dalgleish. And this publication marked another noticeable change in her stylistic approach. All the illustrations, and most significantly her figure work, had now taken on an angular blockish look, which resonated with the folk art of tribal cultures, and equally the cubist influence of her early mentor Archie Penko and others. And it wasn't a one-off departure. The following year's The Three Kings of Saba by Alf Evers was even more extreme in this regard, and returned to the use of flat non-representational colour too. In 1957 she was commissioned by the Limited Editions Club to illustrate another Jane Austen novel, Sense and Sensibility, and the resulting book confirmed that her conversion and commitment to less organic image creation was apparently permanent. There were still enough similarities evident to remind us that it was indeed Helen Sewell who had created them, and in particular her tightly controlled hatching, cross-hatching and stippling techniques were very much in evidence. But it was the application of her recent transition to more carved-looking, stylised figure work which made this such an unexpected and challenging departure from her earlier more representational Pride and Prejudice. Where she might have gone next would unfortunately remain a mystery, as this would be her final work, because 1957 was also the year of her death in New York City at the age of only 60, following what is described as a long illness. Although her career was shorter than that of some others, Helen Sewell had been remarkably prolific. And whether monochrome, selectively coloured or working in full colour, it seems she invariably set out to create something a little different each time, more I suspect to meet her own expectations than those of her readers. She's yet another illustrator who has opened my eyes and mine to styles not confined to my own lifelong personal preferences. And if her work has anything like the same effect on you, that can only be a good thing.